This is a quick background of the topic and its relevance. So, yeah, nation state as a concept, we know it's more or less it has become default. Most of our recent articulations have also been around that, but uh, it's a fairly recent concept. It came about in the recent centuries, and it rose to prominence, especially with the rise of the West as and the Western powers as the dominant world powers. But we can say it's not an eternal model. It's neither perfect nor you know universally applicable. And in the last century, the Eastern civilization started decolonizing India, China, Japan, and as the Eastern civilizations strengthen and consolidate, they started seeking a more suitable model for them that aligns to their own aspirations, a state and a nation that reflects their civilizational ethos. And all these civilizations are predominantly dharmic in nature, uh, whether or not they use that word explicitly, but we can relate to, most of them can relate to the concept that underlies it, dharma, dhamma. And intrinsically, they seek a dharma raja, whether they articulate it that way or not explicitly. And most of these civilizations have currently, adopted alien states following the dominant models. But their craving to express their aspirations and create for themselves better models has become started becoming visible of late. So a future statecraft, if we are going to discuss, that is going to derive more from Eastern civilization ethos. And in that sense, Dharmarajya is something of future. It is going to be there. It's not just that the Indians crave or some subset of Indians crave. It is something innately a lot of civilizations and vast majorities of them are going to, you know, push for and crave to realize. At the same time, Bharat cannot wait on all of them. We will need to define for ourselves our Dharmarajya. Bharata has to, in fact, pioneer this by virtue of our own tradition. So this is the background from which I want to see the topic. A brief introduction, then a contrast between the constitution and Smriti, Rashtra Rajya and the nation state. And then trying to project how a dharmic constitution or Smriti would look like for future. And the nature of a Dharmarajya. And then conclude. So Dharmarajya as a term, I don't know that being a very dominantly heard term these days or even a few decades earlier. But whether or not that term is used, we know that craving is there. A lot of people express it in different ways in terms of what kinds of policies they want, what is the nature of the state they would like to envisage, and what are the kinds of responsibilities they would like to see the state delivering based on the epics, the Mahabharata, Itihasa, or based on the Dharma Shastra, things like that. If we look at it as a subject, the instruments of the state, the policies, the laws, all of these can be called as the manifest fourth leg of that subject. And if we take the Purusha Sukta equivalence, it says Padosya Vishwabhutani, Tripadasya Amritam Devi. Only the manifest fourth leg is what is visible as the world. And then there are three underlying ones that are invisible. It's visible only to the seers. So in that sense, for this subject, the policies, the laws, the instruments of the state, the effects of the laws, all these are only the manifest fourth leg. What underlies that is an architecture of a state. And what underlies the architecture of the state is a doctrine of statecraft. It says what should be the nature of the state, what should be the principles by which state should be governing, what are the ideals that state should subscribe to, and so on. And underlying that in turn is a worldview or a darshana. So we can systematize this subject, the statecraft, only when we get to all these four levels and articulate our position and say this is how things are going to be. And at the root of all this is a Dharmashastra. Dharmashastra gives the goal, and Ardha is the way by which Dharma is fulfilled. It gives the means to fulfill Dharma. In that sense, Ardhashastra gives the design and the instruments. So that basically is the relation between an Ardhashastra and the Dharmashastra. So unless we put up our Dharmashastra, a Dharmarajya cannot be realized. That's my proposition. And from that perspective, I would like to focus more on the conceptual basis of how a Dharmashastra can be articulated. And for that purpose, we use a lot of anecdotes, not necessarily as arguments to prove or anything, but so that we can convey what we are intending to convey. And as part of this, there is a contrast between the foundational documents. We discussed the Smriti versus the constitution, or the state versus the Rajya, and all these. But again, the intent is not to evaluate the merits of things, but unless we have a reference point or we can compare to what we can see and relate to, it's a bit difficult to explain what we want to conceptualize. We take it for granted. We don't wish to argue that a state that aligns with the nation is required. It is assumed we assert as an assumption, as a premise, that we require a state that aligns with the nation. And there is no emphasis specifically laid on a political model. We don't want to propose anything, an executive structure or laws, because we believe they will emerge more as a result of a right understanding of Rashtra and the Dharmashastra. Once we have the basis, then we define a character of the state, then rest of the things follow, the political model will follow, more as corollaries of that. So are there precedents for this? Have people actually tried to articulate? There are a few works. There have been very good attempts. One is Rashtra Loka by Amrita Vagbhava, and Kavyakantha Vasishtha Ganapati Muni has given this Samraja Nibandhanam. And Swaraj Bill of 1895, where it is said there is a role of Lokmanya Tilak behind that, and then Deshik Shastra, which is given by Badri Saha. So these can be seen more as constitutional or projecting works, saying this is how things need to be. And but there are a lot of analytical works that go into the past and try to explain how the governance was in ancient India, what the political thought was. Have there been attempts to systematize all this and say this is the value, this is the structure of how the constitution should look like, how the layout should be, and things like that? Not many efforts have been done so far, or at least I am not aware of. So just the way constitution is the foundational document for a nation state, Smriti or a Dharmashastra is the foundational document for a Dharmarajya. A comparison between them would give us a fair idea of how we should be leading at a Dharmarajya. So firstly, their layout itself is fundamentally different. The content-wise, the merits of policies, that is one thing, but the very architecture of those documents are different. The Constitution predominantly has prescriptive content. Means it says we the people of this country, this is what we envisage for ourselves, these are the ideals we would like to stick to, and then we define a state for that, and state shall do this, do that. There is a framework of rights and framework of responsibilities for the state, and the rights that people have that state will be responsible for protecting, and so on. And then there will be laws and things like that. Dharmashastra, on the contrary, it starts with ontological content. It says this is the nature of the world, this is the nature of man, this is the nature of society. And this is the basis, conceptual basis it takes, based on which it articulates how a state should be. In that sense, this is a refutable document based on the ontological content. If something can be changed, something can be shown as wrong, that can be corrected in the ontological content, and whatever corrections come follow in the subsequent sections. The nature of the state accordingly will have to revise. The responsibilities of state will change according to that. In that sense, it is both refutable and modifiable. I would say it's a more systematic document in that sense. Constitution, on the contrary, is definitely modifiable, but the structure for modification is not provided as part of the Constitution itself. It comes from assumptions outside the document itself. And then the Constitution also, in terms of layering, yeah, it has some layers. We say there is a basic structure, but basic structure hasn't been always part of the original version of the Constitution. What came later defined as a basic structure is basically a set of uncompromised principles, assumed to be uncompromised in the Constitution. But primarily, it's a temporal document. It's an evolving document. Dharmashastra, on the other hand, has layered content. It's stratified into several layers. One is the eternal universal layer, which is called Sanatana. Then there is a temporal layer, which is called Yuga. And then there is a time-space layer, which is called Deshakala. So here the region diversity comes. Then the time specifically situational things will come. A lot of these content will be in the Deshakala layers of the Dharmashastras. In terms of applicability, it's known the Constitution is given for a nation state. So the state defines it. It is defined for a state, for that body of land, for that geography. In a Dharmashastra, there is a distinction between the law of the land from the natural and universal righteous order. So even before we define that landscape, we talk of something permanent, then we define what the landscape is, where the law of land applies. In the sense, the geopolitical and the geocultural almost coincide. Whereas in the Dharmashastra, it is not always so. There is an orthogonality of institutions of state and the nation. Relating to the first point we discussed is the next one, the moral scheme. Constitution assumes a moral scheme. It doesn't explicitly spell out a moral scheme. It says public morality, and then so whatever is agreed as the collective moral order, that will be codified. That will not be codified, but that will be followed by the laws. Whereas in a Dharmashastra, it is slightly different. It goes ahead and formally codifies those assumed moral schemes, based on which the laws will derive. And in a constitution, it defines explicitly a framework of rights, which the state is responsible for protecting. And execution of duties will be there, but responsibilities are more applicable for state. Individual duties have mention, but not rigorous enforcement. Whereas rights and duties is not the dichotomy by which the Dharmashastra goes. It defines the collective goals, individual goals for life, uh, and the means for fulfillment of those goals or the purposes of life, called the Purusharthas. And the state's responsibility is primarily to enable people fulfill their Purusharthas. Coming to the matter of religion, constitution, so based on the nature of the state, it could be either secular or theocratic. Whereas this kind of dichotomy really doesn't apply in a Dharmashastra, in a Smriti, because there is no religious or profane dichotomy. In fact, Dharmashastra recommends state to be agnostic of tradition. At the same time, it acknowledges a religious ecosystem where liberties of people need to be protected, regardless of where they belong. And finally, the constitution is predominantly meant for organized society, which means state directly deals with the individuals and groups and identities. Whereas the Dharmashastra is meant more for an inherited society, which means there are a tradition, there is an ecosystem of traditions where there is continuous passing on of knowledge from generation to generation. That way, most of the collective behavior is derived from inherited learning rather than how an individual sees the state is dealing with it. So this is a fundamental difference. I mean, it may not make a very apparent difference when we look at the laws, but as we codify these things, there will be a phenomenal difference in how it translates into lived experience. To take a small example, education itself. Inherited education is really cheap and sustainable, whereas organized education is costly. In terms of, so before going to the nation state, wanted a quick contrast in terms of how a nation state differs from a traditional rashtra or a rajya for a rashtra. Nation state, we know on the right side, as we see, there is this, there are these geopolitical units for which administrative systems are defined or governing entities are defined. There is a village, town, city, then we have a state for which a state government is there, then this is a union. In a union of states model, the union government has some equation with the states where there is a distribution of power, federalism, and things like that. But primarily, it's a geopolitical entity which assumes that there is one language, one culture for each of these units that it is governing. Whereas in a rashtra, we see landscape is divided or stratified in different ways. Firstly, there are these geocultural units, what we call as deshas. Then we also see the landscape in terms of the different forms. Actually, there is a Punya Bhumi, there is a Tapo Bhumi, Jnana Bhumi. Different kinds of categories in which we see the land, based on which we create centers for excellence there. We have a sacred geography, we have a political geography, we have a cultural geography. In that sense, we also have these equivalents in the sense grama maps a village. So grama, nagara, patana, these things are there. There are then janapadas, small, bigger units over these. Then there are deshas, which are cultural units, geocultural units. Then there is a varsha or khanda. There is a rashtra. It's abstract, but we can say, let us say, if we have to say Bharata is a rashtra, at that level, it can still map to a larger geocultural unity. Then we have a Dvipa, which is more like a continent, and then there is a Vasundhara, the Earth family, as we call it. And then for these, once we have defined the cultural units, Based on these, we define the political units. Historically, if we see, there have been several attempts to get the entire subcontinent under one political umbrella. And for that, there have been different ways. There are Ashwamedha, Rajasuya, Vaishnava. There are rituals that kings used to conduct where they used to establish their supremacy. But that required somebody of high capability or military capability, especially to bring everybody under an umbrella, and then the ability to keep them under one umbrella. So it was not always a permanent feature that we had a Chakravarti. There were very big empires. There are the canonical 6 Chakravartis as we talk of, like Kartavirya, Sagara. And then we had Rama, then Yudhishthira, Vikramarka. There were a lot of people who did that, but it was not always the case. Here is a quick contrast between the nation state and the Rashtra. The Indian Union, we know, is a welfare seeking one. It wishes to establish welfare while it enables people. But Bharata, we know the name itself suggests it is enlightenment seeking, fulfillment seeking. Welfare is there, it's articulated very well, but it is basic. Geographically, the geocultural and geopolitical have to coincide in a nation state, whereas in a Rashtra, it doesn't have to. The geopolitical is a temporal unit, it can change. The boundaries keep changing, whereas the geocultural units are more permanent units, which can be agnostic of the political fortunes. Of course, political fortunes do influence their growth, the progress to an extent, but these units survive by themselves. The nature of unity in the Indian Union or in a nation state is predominantly political and military, whereas in the Rashtra it is cultural and civil. And there are side effects of both. In fact, in a nation state, especially in a democracy, the political unit assumes importance. It politicizes most aspects of the life. All struggles and end of the day become civilian, whether it is governing policies, education, religion, everything eventually gets a political angle. Whereas in a Rashtra, it is not exactly the same. There can exist spheres of life that are agnostic of polity. Harmony is achieved mostly in the cultural sphere. The nation state takes cognizance of the political and military identity and unity of the nation. It doesn't always take cognizance. So it does definitely assume a culture. It's not completely agnostic of culture. It says this is the culture, this is the civilization we are representing. But it has to be one culture, one language. So in that sense, we can see how our states also have become, states with one official language. And they have created their own divisions in the society, in fact. Whereas in a Rashtra, there are several types of integration motives. The regional, there are different levels of collectivities. The individual is there, then the cultural units are there, the social units are there. There are groups that enable aesthetic fulfillment. Then, in that sense, it becomes a matrix of integration motives. And all these identities put together build up a net of civilizational identity. When we say there is one Hindu culture, it is not exactly one unit that we are talking of. This is a matrix that has all these different collectivities coming together. So the nature of unity is also going to be very defined. Identities in a nation state are largely a flat space, and there is no hierarchy of or the matrix of identities that a nation state takes cognizance of. The polity does not take cognizance of matrix of identities. It does take cognizance of identities. Any group can represent itself, says this is what we are, but they cannot say this is the system or the scheme of identities. Whereas in a Rashtra, that is there. The nation state, it's primarily, though excellence is one of the motives, primarily the responsibilities of state are in ensuring there is parity, whereas in a Rashtra, it is the upward mobility. It's a dynamic that it takes cognizance of. The more important part, I mean, it's usually told in a democracy that it represents public will, but it has an assumption that the elected representatives represent the public will, which may or may not always be the case, as we have seen over decades. Especially in a diverse society where there is no monolithic opinion, the notion of representation is very ambiguous. Whereas in a Rashtra, there is no such assumption. There are mechanisms and instruments for translating public will to identify and articulate this is the public will and then translating it into. We can see even in folk stories how the kings used to get their people gather public opinion without even people knowing it. And being a primarily political animal, the state in a nation state incentivizes more consolidation and voicing of opinion and aggression unwittingly. Whereas in a Rashtra, tolerance and diversity are sustainable. We don't. And if from a society perspective, in a nation state, identities tend to become disintegration motives rather than integration motives. So these linguistic barriers are artificially created, the culture barriers are there, then the state boundaries. Whereas these collective identities become integration motives in a Rashtra, which is what forms a web of civilizational identity. And a nation state legalizes in the sense that state authorizes the interaction, human interaction, it authorizes marriages and things like that. In a Rashtra, most of the social institutions are autonomous. Society is largely self-regulating. State enters only as a final arbiter. Before we had this nation state, there was a lot of harmony culturally in various regions. If we take the example of Carnatic, Kannada origin, then majority of the kirtanas were done in Telugu, and experts had mostly come from Tamil land. So in that sense, there was no language or culture barrier between them because of political boundaries. They all fell under different governing entities, geopolitical entities, but culturally they never had this problem. They came together. The culture could be synthesized. Languages developed. In fact, multiple languages developed. Most people understood more languages. But once the geopolitical barriers came and they started formalizing one language, one culture, all these started becoming disintegration motives. Is there an alternative? Yes, the Dharmarajya, as we proposed earlier, Dharmarajya we believe will be a good alternative to what we have as a nation state. Is it fully developed as an idea? No, but it needs to be developed. And the basis for that will be a Dharmashastra. One is the layering and structuring of the document itself. Then what it tells about the nature of the individual and the society, and the state and the socio-cultural institutions, and how the state deals with these. Then it comes to the Rajadharma. In fact, Rajadharma is what comes in the very early sections of the constitution, whereas in a Smriti it comes much later. The Rajadharma is where we articulate the responsibilities of the state and the head of the state. Then the moral scheme, in fact, moral scheme partly comes ahead of Rajadharma, and then part of it comes later as it discusses the legal matters, the justice and penalty. Though jurisprudence is not primarily what we want to discuss today, as a case in point, we can demonstrate how different it might look like in a Dharmashastra from a constitution. If we want to use the word basic structure, what would be contained in a basic structure? would be the unchanging principles and the universal order. This more or less is the Sanatana layer. So it would discuss the consciousness qualities, the sattva, rajas, tamo gunas, and the guna karma, the principle of action or the dharma and the karma, the nature of dharma, the nature of action, and then the human craving for fulfillment, the nature of human, nature of man, then what kind of cravings a man has if he has this nature. To take an example, we say man has wants, man has needs, and then these needs to be fulfilled for happiness, and then these are all assumed in a constitution. These are not explicitly stated. These are stated in different theories, and then in constitution they become visible as policies based on these assumptions. Whereas in a Dharma Shastra we explicitly discuss these. We say man could be having these three qualities. Then his attributes are there, then his craving is there, then his action is there. If these need to align, if they align, he has best results in life. For them to align, we need this kind of institution. That's how it systematically proposes what it wants to legalize. Then it discusses the nation's defining features, the geocultural units, the landscape primarily, then the units within that, the desha as we call it, and then the social institutions. Then it defines a governing entity for the nation. It defines the law of the land. It first defines the land where the law of the land applies, then the law of the land. As the name itself says, Dharma Shastra, its main purpose is to explain the nature of Dharma. And the best source of this, apart from Dharma Shastra, though they are also called Dharma Shastra, in fact, Mahabharata, the Itihasa is there. And various places in the Purana, we have very good illustrative examples where the chiefs go to the kings and ask them questionnaire. There is a standard questionnaire. Usually they ask, are the people, innocent people, fearlessly roaming around? Is there enough fear in people, in the criminals, to commit the crime? There is a fairly standard set. Most of these instances we can come across. That gives us one good idea of how Rajadharma is seen. But this is ahead of that, and Rajadharma is instantiated as one role of one entity in the entire society. Before that, the Smriti discusses the nature of the Dharma in general, which is basically what are the principles, primal principles, what the nature is, what the world is, how the world has come into existence, what is the purpose of that, and then what is the purpose of life. So here the consciousness qualities is Sattva, Rajas, Tamo, the three qualities that enable the different kinds of phenomenal experiences of humans that they are discussed. One assumption that is made here, because it is ontological, is that nature is our teacher and our trustee. We derive all the lessons from nature. When our institutions are founded on principles closest to the nature, we believe that the society can evolve by itself rather than being organized into doing something. Society can self-regulate and evolve as an organism. And in that sense, it will be resilient as well as it can evolve into a more civilized order incrementally. So some of the principles we take, from lessons we take from the nature. One example is complementarity. There is a balance that is created when we enable multiple entities, groups, or tendencies in the society. They will tend to balance each other out over time rather than we having to create a balance using state power. Then things have cyclic nature. Every phenomenon has a cyclic nature. We take this explicitly into cognizance. It has its benefits. Then we define goals of life and then how to fulfill them. Then the different roles that an individual has and the different dharmas. Let us say there is a Vyakti. As an individual has his own dharmas. Then he has his responsibilities as a spouse, as a offspring, as a parent, as a member of the family, as a member of the clan, as a member of a region, and so on. So at different levels, even as a king. So at different levels, individual has different roles. For each of these, there has been a codified set or codified behavior. What is the tendency? What is the fulfillment? What an individual would crave to do in that position? What gives him the best fulfillment? That involves duties also, but duty is not primarily the way by which it is defined. So that's why we call it a better translation to dharma would be natural righteous order. It is the intrinsic nature of the being. It's not an imperative. And if we have to contrast it, the Kantian categorical imperative, it's not universal in that sense, but it is universal by virtue of it being present everywhere. There is a universe has an order. The cosmic order is called the Rita. And then the same principle is operative in every being, which is dharma. So it is still universal, but it is yet not universal. It needs its own contextual treatment. So if we have to state an equivalent imperative or equivalent to imperative, dharma is basically about knowing one's true nature and being true to one's nature. And based on these roles and these cravings, the collectivities are designed. The different collectivities or the institutions are vehicles meant for fulfillment of individuals. And they bring about the harmony between the micro and the macro. In that sense, by fulfillment of roles and cravings at different levels, people are fulfilling their dharma at different levels, and that's how dharma is actually building from the bottom, from the smallest unit to the largest unit, rather than getting enforced from the top to the down. This is how probably pictorially we can represent how the institutions might look like. There is the micro at the bottom, where the individuals are there, each being has its own nature. There are purusharthas, there are fulfillment. And there is a dharma, the operating principle of each being. Then at the top, we have the cosmic view, where there is the Rita or the cosmic order. So all the abstractions or the concepts that apply universally are articulated there. The pantheism is there, the causation principles are there, or theories of causation are there, or the concept of Varna is there. It's basically on what is universal. And then we have, between these, we have so many collectivities that are trying to harmonize the individual through at different levels with the highest level or the universal. So for that, in the center is the hierarchical structure, power structure, that is the state or the Rajya. Three primary elements. One is the head of the state, obviously. Then the Mantranga is there, which is the visionary body. Then we have the Amatya or the executive body. These three, if we have to take, in a Shastra equivalence, these three more or less represent the three kinds of power: the will, knowledge, and the action. Head of the state represents the will. In a democracy, he represents the collective will of the people. In a monarchy, he represents the divine will or whatever it is. And then on the left, we have what is continuous across time. So the sampradayas or the traditions, they are the streams that come uninterrupted, and they are the sustaining entities. They are the bedrock of the civilization. And on the right, we have a stratified yet non-hierarchical social institutions that the individual relates to. At the bottom, if we see, the individual relates to the The smallest unit of collectivity an individual relates to is a family. Then there are clans, there are occupational units, there are cultural units, there are different levels of units. These don't necessarily become a hierarchy of granularity. It's not necessarily that each of these units has to be part of something bigger, which is in turn part of something bigger. They form a network. The best example is Jati versus Desha. Desha can have many Jatis, and Jati also can span many Deshas. So if we don't take cognizance of this fluidity, we tend to see them as rigid units, and then policies that come out of those would suffer those side effects. So Smriti does not explicitly articulate these, but what it does is it assumes that these naturally exist. It doesn't say what all kinds of collectivities exist. It explicitly states what exists at the micro and the macro level. Anything in between is temporal, it can change. Those units will change, the nature of those units will change. They are not the primary focus, though the content will be there. As Smritis evolve from time to time, that content is liable to change. But what does not change is the nature of the individual and the nature of the universe. And once it generalizes the human aspirations, it becomes very easy to articulate what is required for the state to enable these. And Smriti usually has a policy. I mean, it's not very articulated, but it has a policy to trade off the temporal with the permanent. The permanent should not suffer, that is primary. But at the same time, situations come because of which the permanent is temporarily compromised to give precedence to a temporary principle. A Deshakala exigency might take more precedence. And the most important thing here is it tries to incentivize human effort and aspiration towards excellence and upward mobility. The idea is that each individual ultimately needs to fulfill himself, excel himself. And collectivities are vehicles. That way, collectivities also become vehicles for excellence. And identities are not incentivized. It's not identity, but all identities are in-phased or inward looking, whether it is the tradition, whether it is the clan, whether it is the occupational unit. These look at excelling within themselves rather than these are becoming identities that give an individual bargaining power with other units. Of course, they give, but that's not their motive. So, economy is one thing. I mean, the subject is more aptly dealt with in Ardhashastra than a Dharmashastra, but there are a few indicators that we can see in a Dharmashastra. Independence, security, and prosperity. There are primary goals by which the Ardhashastra creates instruments to fulfill these goals. One of the advantages we have, if we look at the institutions, is they give a matrix that is resilient. Any type of collectivity suffers, there are others to balance out and make up for it on a temporary basis until we restore balance. So, and that kind of phenomena kept going on for a long time until the superstructure itself got demolished, if we look at the past. And whenever there has been a recovery from a trough or a, let us say, Wizarding regime has occupied, we have recovered, there are measures to recover, impose temporary correctives, to remove the disabilities, to help the oppressed parts of the society. State has instruments to do that, but they have seldom resulted in any discrimination or anything. And temples are run by the religious institutions or the spiritual institutions, since they are part of the society, they are largely self-regulated, autonomous, run from within the society. The state has nearly no role in them. Though state funds them, state doesn't manage them. They are mostly run by the dharmic trusts. They are aligned to the traditions. And these institutions have served as centers of high civilization and excellence, learning, aesthetics, ritual, philanthropy. The host of activities uh, ran around the temple. State naturally funded them because they were centers of Abhyudaya. Though we don't have an explicit word called religion here, we had, in fact, to an extent, we still have an ecosystem where we have full life cycle of traditions. A lot of traditions came about, they served their purpose, they got dissolved into the ecosystem. And that is possible when we take cognizance of that ecosystem instead of dividing, state taking cognizance of these groups and trying to incentivize or giving rights to them. Needless to say, the concept of majority minority doesn't really apply in a diverse society. You have hundreds of groups, hundreds of traditions, calling one as majority. By artificially grouping a lot of things doesn't make a lot of sense. And these traditions thrive mostly through, they mutually enrich each other, they engage with each other. And there are set rules that everybody accepted for that engagement. And that is not decided by the state. That was that organically evolved from within the ecosystem of these traditions. And each tradition, needless to say, is infaced for practices. Though they had their missionary element, the infaced nature is what resulted in their excellence. And state does not grant any explicit right to propagate. Right is only to practice. Propagation is a result of the credibility we earn through the system. And there are ways to establish one's merit and credibility. The state, in that sense, is you can say, Sampradaya Nirapeksha Dharma Raja. Basically, agnostic of traditions, but its anchor is still the Dharma. The righteous order is its reference point. And this does not definitely stop the state from acting on deviant individuals or even traditions or groups. So, an entire cult misbehaves. There is nothing that stops the state from acting on it, penalizing it. We have seen Bhoja do it. We have seen Shivaji Maharaj do it. The next section in a Dharma Shastra would be the Raja Dharma, which articulates the nature of the Rajya and the Raja. Raja in the sense of a head of the state, whether he is or whether he is not a monarch. And here again, the word dharma needs to be carefully applied. It's basically not just a set of responsibilities of the state the way a constitution defines. It is basically the intrinsic nature and the vehicle for fulfillment of a state's own purushartha and the ruler's own purushartha. In that sense, what is the fulfillment for a state? In a way that it aligns best with the fulfillment of the nation. That is how Rajadharma is defined. And permanent principles for this are defined in the Dharma Shastra. The instruments for fulfilling these are defined in the Artha Shastra. State legislates its own responsibilities and society regulates its own responsibilities. So state doesn't actually try to define what the society, social divisions are or things like that. These are temporal elements. They could be instruments from time to time where the state could act, but they never became part of the Dharma Shastra, which is supposed to be more permanent in nature. State's entry is mostly reactive in matters of arbitration rather than an active monitoring. Some of the principles of the Rajadharma, when we keep coming across, even in folklore, right from Itihasa, the Dharma Shastra, folklore at every level. One is Raja is the Palaka. He's like the parent, he looks after the people. Then Rajasya Moolam Raja, he is the root of the state. If tree is seen as a state, he is the root of it. He's the head of the state, uh, the ministry and executive. These three map to the three kinds of power: the will, power, and action. We can say Icha, Jnana, and Kriya. In fact, a very good instance or example we have citation in the Lalita Upakhyana, where the Maharagni, she is the queen, Lalita Devi, and then her Mantrini or the minister, she is the representative of the power of knowledge. Then there is Dandanatha, the executive or the general. She is representative of the power of the action, the Varahi Devi. The next principle is Yatha Raja Tatha Praja. We would have heard of this so many times, but it's not taken as seriously. I mean, in fact, we can see it today. Whenever there is a good ruler, we can see a phenomenal change in the way people perceive the health of their nation, how good things are going in the country, and they feel themselves responsible towards the society and themselves. Where the state is irresponsible, we also see people being irresponsible. It's never the other way around. We never say the Yatha Praja Tatha Raja. King doesn't behave based on people. Based on the king, the people take liberties or don't take liberties or feel responsible or feel irresponsible. In that sense, it is very important, and tradition has placed a lot of importance in ensuring the right man comes to the top. And whenever there was a deviance, there was a lot of premium placed on replacing the regime with the right one, as we can see in the huge wars, the Mahabharata. And two qualities that the head of the state should be having definitely are, Praja Ranjakatva. His rule should be pleasing to the people. People should be happy with the rule. Even in perception, not just in enjoying the benefits of the rule. And Siksha Dakshata. The innocent should be fearless and the criminal should be fearing. And, these are the active roles of the king. He needs to protect the state and the nation from external aggression and internal turbulence. He needs to protect the weak. There should be a fair taxation. There should be excellent administration in terms of town planning, hygiene, and then he is responsible for synthesizing energy centers. This is not a very articulated role, but it can be seen in many instances. Whenever there is a good king, he does all this. He creates centers of political, military, economic, educational centers of excellence as well as strength. And the Dharma Shastra actually gives a lot of prominence to justice and penalty, the jurisprudence. So the permanent principles are here, and the temporal ones need to come from more the instrumental, texts like Ardhashastra. Enforcement of the collective order is made the responsibility of the state, and order comes more from the permanent principles. The local units of the collectivities, these are all not exactly defined. This Raja does not take cognizance of that in a general sense, but it takes cognizance of them in a very specific sense, depending on how its perception of the law and order is. And state machinery's effectiveness in ensuring a crime-free society. It is always said we should respect the law, but law gets respect based on how much it deserves respect in public view. So if it is perceived as fair and equal, then it will get respect. So state machinery is responsible to ensure that perception is going to the people along with its implementation. How much the law is feared by the offenders, how much the state creates fearlessness in the innocent, how transparent and corruption free the nexus of local social regulating authorities and the state machinery is. This is not a very easy thing, but it is said as an explicit goal because its importance cannot be exaggerated. And it has also a goal to minimize the need for state arbitration. Society needs to be as self-regulating as possible. State needs to be non-coercive. State can be non-coercive only in that case. The more state has to interfere, the tendency of state to become coercive will increase. So these are a few bases for determining the penalty that state imposes. One is to make sure the individual expiates for his, since it is said that if the individual doesn't pay for what he does, then he will pay for it in the other world. So the king actually is helping in a way by making the individual pay here, and that also ensures deterrence of crime because he's making example of offenders, and that creates fear among the offenders. And there should be a fair proportion of penalty. Realization and transformation in the individual has been called ideal. I mean, there is an effort to show its importance, though it is not a very formally stated. There is no formally stated mechanism for that. Prevention of disproportionate penalty is definitely, because then the king will, ruler will start being seen as a tyrant. There are a few bases for just penalty. One is the nature of the offense, the motive behind the offense, then the position of the individual, and the impact of penalty. This is one thing that contrasts the Dharmashastra from the constitution, where equal penalty is applied in the modern nation state. Basically, if there is an equal penalty between the weak and the strong, let us say a politician and a lower grade clerk, the impact it has on the life of the clerk is huge, and the impact it has on the politician is very little. In that sense, there is very little fear in the powerful. So the position and the nature of the individual is taken explicit cognizance of before imposing the penalty. Now, is this subjective? If this is not objective, how can we ensure fairness? That is the subject that needs to be developed. I mean, it was there, that knowledge was there, but as we develop a text for a new age, it needs to be explicitly stated. The last section is the geopolity. The federal nature of the system is usually reflected here. So the Deshakala layer almost is entirely controlled by the regional units of power, the geopolitical units at each region. But the geocultural unit still remains the basis for policy. Even if a king rules multiple geocultural units, he is responsible to apply different laws as applicable for those cultural units than he articulating what he wants for his political unit. And all the regional and central units have to adhere fully to the Sanatana, or the eternal layer. Based on the strength and the span and things like that, the regional units of power have their own negotiation with the central units or the bigger units in terms of what kind of laws they would be controlling, what is their relation to the union, there is trade-off of their power and things like that. They negotiate the temporal layers, they retain autonomy on the Deshakala layer. Arbitrating and administrative systems build bottom up from the local, the family, from the village to the towns, and each of them have their own administrative systems and the legal systems. Their nature will also differ based on the nature of the region. The security and administrative systems, they find place more in the text of statecraft, more Ardhashastra domain, because these are mostly temporal. The fact that they exist is what we can see. As a political model, we don't see any explicit dichotomy between principality and republic in Bharata as we have seen elsewhere in the world. So alternatively, even if we say democracy is what is ideal and things like that, it's not necessary that its alternative has to be a monarchy, we need to define a model that best suits the future. Democracy has also evolved as one stage. It is a default today. It has been an improvement, definite improvement over the previous phases in human evolution, but it can't be said to be the ideal. So future craving of mankind, we will have to evolve a better model than that, and it will evolve in time. But their basis should be these permanent principles. So to conclude, the basis for a Smriti or Dharma Shastra for a new age has to have the understanding of traditional Smritis, not as rule books. They are not imperative, but they are ontological. They are guides to nature. So we need to take that wisdom and apply only that eternal prism, the dharmic prism, to present and the future, so that what we frame will best reflect our aspirations. We have to adopt the permanent nature elements from the older ones. We have to, but we have come a long way. So there is a disconnect also. So the temporal and the Deshakala layers need to be developed almost afresh. And they need to be applied appropriately to the union and the regional units. As part of that, we need to ensure that the state aligns with the nature of the nation, rather than state defines what the nation should be, what the society should be, how it should be. The art given by the state is what is problematic. And state plays an active role in facing external problems. It plays a very passive role in strengthening the institutions of the society. And it invests in Abhyudaya and Nishreyasa of individual and collective. In that sense, we believe developing a Smriti holds the key for the future statecraft evolution of a Dharmarajya. That definitely requires retrieving the Indic traditions from where they are. They are almost in ICU now. They need to come back from a preservation mode into a synthesis mode. They need to generate the knowledge required for future.
The dharmic state, the Dharma Rajya or the Rashtra, is largely the righteous order, or the individual is first, correct? Which is the natural state of the purpose of a human being's growth, and so on and so forth. Now, this is in complete contrast to, say, Abrahamic religions, which is where Allah or God has dictated how man is supposed to be. So obviously the Rajya or the Rashtra and the framework of that will be, I mean, this does not fit that idea. Their worldview does not fit an Indic worldview at all, is a confirmation I wanted to get from you. That's part one. Part two of the question is that, given, suppose we are able to pull our traditions out of and able to implement more of a Dharma Rashtra, could Islam and Christianity actually fit the notion of a sampradaya within the context of all other sampradayas? So there are 2 or 3 questions I'm trying to ask. It's a little hard for me to articulate at this point, but if you could.
Sure. From what I understood, yeah, the first thing, definitely, I didn't use the word normative versus ontological intentionally, but when we discuss that imperative versus the ontological, that's where, so basically you ought to do this. That's the kind of normative scheme that the Abrahamics have, and that reflects in the nature of the constitution itself. Constitution does not say this is how the nature of things are. It says this is what the state needs to do, this is what the individual needs to do. So that is so once we fix the nature of the foundational document, it will reflect in all the institutions automatically. We don't have to explicitly address the how we codify for the tradition. We have given that freedom at by articulating the state itself. So the state does not have to uh, when it is not saying any ought, when it is articulating the responsibilities only for the state, but it is not saying this is how the nation or the society or the individual should be, we have already taken the control out of the hand of the state. So in that sense, the state ceases to be Abrahamic already, if we have a Dharma Shastra as the foundational text.
Okay, now within the state of a Dharma Shastra, how do these religions at all survive? How are they going to be able to coexist, if at all? Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, so that is up to them, but they need to abide by principles of coexistence. You can coexist with others, you are good. You can't coexist, you have a problem. So we are not telling how you manage it yourself. And that's the difference. Let us say, when Shivaji Maharaj dealt, or when Bhojadeva dealt with different traditions, he did go after them, he penalized them, they penalized them, where they were found deviant according to the native norms. So that is fine. So if the problem today is we incentivize the evangelizing tradition, right? Those that are aggressive are incentivized explicitly by the state. So once that is removed, when propagation itself is not a default right, practice everybody has right. Propagation is something that needs to be earned by credibility. Right? If there is an ecosystem where these traditions are there, they engage in argumentation, credibility gets established. That doesn't need to be monitored by a state. Where people like the argument put by somebody, they will automatically get attracted to it. They will start appreciating it. So if traditions can grow by themselves, it is fine. Where traditions start using deceptive means or aggressive means, violating others' liberties, then the state will come into picture, and state will act in more in terms of controlling the law and order. They are not acting to incentivize any tradition, but to make sure they protect the liberties of the people. So yeah, in that environment, you want to survive, you have to change your ways. I mean, we don't say what you need to do, but that's the harmonious way.
Very nice talk, and so many clarifications are there in the tables. I have one question, that in Dharma Rajya, how a Rajya deal with another Rajya who has a different kind of language and then food. So how they used to deal with each other? It's always means fighting kind of thing, or it's a very harmonious dealing? Means in present time we can see how the international relations were there.
Yeah, so if let us say you take a Vijayanagara or Maratha, I don't think they tried to put their language in all the regions they rule. They took it that each region has its own language, its own culture. And the state that is dealing with all this didn't necessarily try to put its own language, because there is no official language that needs to be imposed on all regions. In a nation state, there is one language, one culture, one political unit for it. That is what we currently suffer from. But once we remove that linking, and there are two orthogonal institutions, sets of institutions, society has its own thing, the language is there, the culture is there, people interact by themselves. They are not bound by the political boundaries at all. So one king dealing with another king is almost regardless of all this.
So just to build on to Alok Tripathiji's question, so when there was prevalence of, say, Buddhism, or if imagine now, I mean, you said basically that there is cultural unity. What does cultural unity mean? I mean, I know what it means, but would an aggressive religion, say, you talked about the subcontinent, right, was always tied in a cultural unity, even though there were janpadas which were interacting with each other. In today's context, in the subcontinent, with two Islamic countries on either side of our borders.
Mm.
As far as I understand, coexisting with them as a Janpada under an Indian union, under an Indian Dharma Rashtra, is probably impossible in the current framework that you've given. And that was the tied question, I had earlier, because there is no cultural unity, there is no understanding of the individual's path. It is all God given, Allah given diktat. So in that
So
sense, how can they ever coexist? They probably cannot.
the process in which it actually got established in the first place, let us say when partition happened, Punjab had its culture, Sindh had its culture, Baloch had its culture. So this entity, the religious entity, the theocratic entity came by supplanting that cultural entity. So the reversal of that process is what harmonizes that region again into the, dharmic union, right?
But the cultural unity is an
Not
almost
necessarily. So it's more than unity. The moment that cultural entity is taken cognizance of, let us say Punjab has its culture. Now it is replaced. Now there is only Islam and there is Urdu. But the moment we take cognizance of Panchanada region, its own culture and its own habitat and its own languages, it is becoming a desha. So it's basically what we take cognizance of, what the state takes cognizance of. If state does not take cognizance of religion, then it has instruments to harmonize that territory. I mean, it's not a one-day process. Obviously, there are a lot of incentives placed on those regions, those languages, those cultures, and things like that before that, the assimilation can happen. But there are ways to do it. Yes. But at a very, if I have to say it in one line, yes, the reversal of the process involves putting the culture, putting the language, putting the practices, desha as the unit, instead of religion as the defining feature. Once the state does not take cognizance of religion at all, then the way state deals with those individuals, those groups will start changing. I mean, we don't have to state it as a religion problem. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, thank you, Rahulji, and thank you, Shankarji, for very articulately. I've read this in bits and pieces, but I think you have put it all very well. I think it also builds on the questions previously asked, but I just want to ask you that towards the end of your presentation, you also mentioned that we have gone far from it, right, from the Dharma Rajya concept. So I don't know if you can address this, but how do you think can we get closer to it next? What would be your suggested roadmap in that sense? What should be those institutions on which we should work so that we get closer to this, back to the state of Dharma Rajya, from where we are today?
So if we go to the first one or two slides, the introduction, basically we are looking at the policies and how things might appear. But underlying those policies is that, that architecture of the state, and behind that there is a doctrine, behind that there is a worldview. Once we can define that, and then we develop a Dharma Shastra, the theory is developed, then we can discuss the next stage, or the Ardha Shastra, or the instruments of the state and the duties of the state. Today, I think we are going the reverse way. That is why the roadmap is looking very far. But once we have an articulate view of how the Dharma Shastra looks like, then the Ardha Shastra is a matter of, just following the principle and articulating, problem solving, applying to the society. So I think we need to reverse that, start from the Dharma Shastra instead of from the policy to the Dharma Shastra.
It's very hard to imagine, to Shobhitji's question on how do you start reversing. For example, the constitution itself, there are uncompromisables in the constitution itself, which, so the basic structure of the constitution and all, I don't know how to ever untangle all of this and move stepwise. I guess that was also perhaps building on to Shobhitji's
Yeah, so
question.
if we start changing, laws and then try to change articles in the constitution, that's a churn of the ocean, and that's way too far off. If we have a theory, if we have a shape of how the Dharma Shastra looks like, then there is a statement of this needs to replace the existing one. There is a debate that can start. Without that reference text, we cannot start argument. Today, we are not in a position to start that argument.
There is this constant fear, Shankaraji, of, one worry that comes in to mind in the Dharma Rajya model is the Janpadas. And, the fear is of a disintegration of the Indian Union, right? I mean, after many, many centuries, if you look at Savarkar's work, his key point of why we were colonized was constantly that we were actually broken up into smaller janpadas and we were never united.
Political union.
Political union did not exist. So one fears, all those type of fears also come up in mind, that how do you create a framework to retain the union, the political union, while having the Rajas have independence of how they want to conduct their lives, including completely paradoxical or completely diametrically opposite Janapadas, say for example Baluchistan or Pakistan with a majority Muslim population. How do you create that and how do you retain?
So, political union definitely. So that I agree. I mean, we obviously will not go the bottom up. For political, it has to be top down. But we need to orthogonally separate it from the geocultural unit. It has to be bottom up. Once we have enabled the bottom up geocultural and let things build from smaller units, families, clans, regions, deshas, and things like that, geopolitical has to be top down. So as we articulate, I mean, earlier it was purely based on the capability of the ruler. Right? If there was somebody who could unify multiple regions, he became a bigger king or a Chakravarti or something like that. That definitely will have to change. That's why I said the political model needs to evolve. I didn't want to state what it should be because political union has to be there. It should be articulated top down. And its negotiation of power with the regional unit has to be part of that Ardhashastra. So one political unit at the center having one military, that is it's a given.
There are so many speakers of ours. Dr. Kinrad Elst is here. Mugendra Vinodji is here. Quite a few speakers have gotten together today to listen to your...
It's a privilege to be able to.
My question is that if someone is a Chakravarti Raja, then he will manage a Rashtra or Rajya?
He will rule a Rajya. And under that Rajya, whatever Desha comes, how many ever Deshas come, that will be his dominion at that point. And his policies will have to be also accordingly, so that regional policies apply the Desha Kala at each unit. And then there are some policies that he will be able to apply for all the regions that he is ruling. Rashtra is an organic whole. It's not something that is ruled. In fact, Raja in that sense is a part of the Rashtra itself.
Yeah, actually. So can you justify the things that like Aswamedh Yajna was there?
Mm-hmm.
So where king explained himself ruling over others. So is it means by kindness or character of the king or by military power of the king? How one Rajya accept the Aswamedh Yajna of other Rajya?
It's both. Military aspect is definitely there. And Rajasuya. In fact, Rajasuya was probably less military conflict involved. But military element definitely is there because one who cannot protect his kingdom, even if he is given supremacy, he can't protect everybody. So that one had to prove that capability. There is no doubt about it. It's not a matter of aggression, but it is a matter of demonstrating capability.
Yeah.
And now I think that equation itself has to go, because if there is a union, people have to, anyway, all the regional units contribute in terms of a common military and all that. So it should not matter much.